An Uttaran August Ahaja, President and friends. First of all, thank you very much for your kind invitation. Can I say what a great pleasure it is to be here at Dublin City University this morning for the launch of your Brexit Institute. Professor Fabrini, many congratulations, not least because of your strong reputation as a university for research, excellence and inclusiveness, and it has also been a great honour for me to have been here to hear such a magnificent exposition on Europe's history and development from you, Mr. President. And I hope my opening few words will be kindly regarded as a modest contribution to your special year you have launched to celebrate the Irish language. Now, as well as our discussions in Dublin last year, which I much enjoyed, I had the privilege of listening to your address to both houses of Parliament at Westminster during your state visit in 2014, when you talked about a vision of citizenship shared by our two peoples, and you warned of the risks of a gulf opening up between citizens and politicians. How timely was that warning? As we look around, we see the rise of populism across our continent and on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. And it was a warning that anticipated the EU referendum result in June 2016 in the United Kingdom. A result that affects, above all, the UK, but which also affects the Republic of Ireland more than any other EU member state. And as we learn from life, when a decision is made over which we have no control, but which will result in great consequence for us, it is unquestionably a difficult and an uncomfortable experience. And from all the conversations that I have had, this is what you are feeling now, and no wonder, given how much your trade in goods and agriculture depends on the free trade that you have with the United Kingdom. We are your largest trading partner. Never mind what you must think when you hear from time to time some British politicians talk casually about the benefits of no deal. Now, let me be clear. No deal is not better than a bad deal. No deal is the worst possible deal you could imagine. So may I try and offer some comfort today by saying to you that I simply do not think that there is a majority in the House of Commons that would accept no deal. This is not just about trade in goods and services. It is about the referendum's impact on the border, on the Good Friday Agreement, and on the lives of the people of Northern Ireland and the Republic. And that is where I wish to begin, because our two countries share so much in history, culture, ideas, politics, and people. And the story of all of these things runs like a thread through these aisles and through the lives of so many families, including my own. I have many happy memories of many a family holiday here, pushing brambles aside to peer at gravestones, looking at lists of names in family record centres and finding, after a lot of walking sometimes, finding and then photographing houses, all of which told the story of the lives of both my and my wife's ancestors, Ulster Scots and Irish Catholics, in Rosslea, Cork, Ballinrobe, and here in Dublin, although I must confess that that particular part of the family history involves another university down the road. And many of my Leeds constituents of Irish descent will tell you their own stories about how their families came to leave, settled on the East Bank, and contributed then and now so much to the life of our great city, a long tradition that thrives to this day in the Leeds Irish Centre on the York Road. It is not, of course, an entirely benign or sentimental history, for our relations over the centuries have seen great wrongs, great violence, and a revolution. But that thread has remained in place, and it has found new expression in recent years in ways that would have seemed unimaginable 50 years ago. The Queen's visit to Ireland in 2011, the first by a British head of state since independence. Your visit, President Higgins, your state visit to the UK 3 years later, and the Good Friday Agreement, signed almost 20 years ago, a triumph of patient diplomacy and political courage that has wrought a transformation that I certainly never thought I would see in my lifetime. It has brought peace and normality. It has established institutions like the British Irish Council to promote relationships between the people of these islands. And it has also created something more intangible, but just as precious. It has provided the space and the opportunity for people to be who they are and not to have to make a choice between the different identities that all of us increasingly, in a more complex and interconnected world, have. As Peter Sheridan of Cooperation Ireland put it so eloquently, after the Good Friday Agreement, you had this idea of a region whose inhabitants could be British or Irish or both. Europe made that easier to imagine. Every one of us knows just how important our shared membership of the European Union was to the crafting of the Good Friday Agreement. And every one of us knows that nothing can be allowed to put that agreement at risk as Brexit unfolds. And that is why the issue of the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic has come to symbolise the choice that the UK government has yet still to make about its approach to the next stage of the Brexit process. Now, the Brexit Select Committee has an important job in scrutinising the negotiations and holding the government to account. And from the beginning of our work, I felt it was essential for us to do our job effectively, to hear from those outside Westminster who had things they wanted to say to us. Dublin was the first place outside the United Kingdom that the committee visited in February last year, and today we are back for our second visit. And just before Christmas, we visited the border at Middletown between Armagh and Monaghan. Never before, I suspect, have so many British parliamentarians had their picture taken by so many photographers looking at a piece of tarmac. There was nothing there. That was the whole point. Just a road with yellow and then white lines and traffic. Lots and lots of traffic carrying goods and people travelling back and forth. And as we stood there, we were told of how 30 years earlier, at that very spot, there had been checkpoints, a customs post, an army base, a police station, and watchtowers, all symbols of the Troubles. Now they are gone. And I came away from that visit understanding more clearly than ever before exactly what is at stake and why we all have a responsibility to ensure that it remains a piece of tarmac with no barriers and no border. Now, understandably, this issue, along with money and citizens' rights and the importance of the continuation of the common travel area, came to dominate the Brexit discussions between the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland and the EU before matters came to a head in December at the very end of the negotiations on Phase 1. It was, I'm sure the Prime Minister would say, a very difficult week. But a form of words on the border was eventually found that proved enough to secure agreement and allow progress to move to Phase 2. Those words made it clear that Northern Ireland would not be treated differently from the rest of the United Kingdom, but the UK was committed to full alignment between the whole of the UK and the EU as a fallback, if that proved necessary. Now, some called that wording a fudge. Others described it as kicking the can down the road. It can even be seen as an attempt at alchemy, a promise to turn the base metal of full alignment into the gold of a border with no checks and no infrastructure. And I say that because it is completely unclear at present how this aim of that open border, which all of us support, will be achieved in practice. And many worry that this uncertainty may damage what the Good Friday Agreement has achieved. So this question goes to the heart of the choice facing the UK government and our Parliament in this year, this crucial, defining year, about what kind of future relationship we wish to have with the European Union after we have left its institutions at the end of March next year. It is, after all, a practical problem. In 2016, UK exports to Ireland were worth £26.7 billion, and UK imports from Ireland £20.8 billion. These goods move across the Irish Sea and across that border, and that is why the Select Committee has welcomed the government's commitment to no physical infrastructure at the land border and welcomed its rejection of a customs border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. But in our most recent report, we said this: we do not currently see how it will be possible to reconcile there being no border with the government's policy of leaving the single market and the customs union, which will inevitably make the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland the EU's customs border with the UK. We call upon the government to set out in more detail how a frictionless border can, in practice, be maintained with the UK outside the single market and the customs union. Now, thus far, the answer to the question, what does the UK want, has been to talk about a deep, special and bespoke partnership. But we've now reached the point where that won't do any longer. The government needs to tell all of us what it is seeking, and even more important than that, it needs to tell us what trade-offs it is prepared to make in order to achieve the things it says it wants. There are consequences to the choices it has made, and they cannot be avoided. Which brings me to the customs union and the single market. Continuing tariff-free trade is essential to the British economy, to your economy, to the EU's economy, and to that open border in Northern Ireland. The simplest and the best way to achieve that would be to remain in the customs union. A course of action, as I pointed out yesterday, that David Davis used to support before he became the Brexit Secretary. It's what I think we should do, and it's what the Director General of the CBI, Carolyn Fairbairn, thinks we should do, as she set out in her very significant speech last week. Why? Why? Because 44% of our exports go to our biggest single market, the other member states of the European Union. A further 17% go to countries with whom we already have trade agreements. Why? Because the EU has negotiated them on behalf of all of us. And a further 19% goes to the country to which we, the United Kingdom, sell more than any other. One, incidentally, with which we currently do not have a trade agreement. It is, of course, the United States of America. Now, do we really think that the President of the United States will be keen to see Britain selling even more goods into the American market? I somehow think not, given the protectionist approach he has taken to trade. What do we think will be the reaction from India to the suggestion of a free trade agreement with the United Kingdom? Their first request will be for more work visas for their citizens. And has China suffered disadvantage because it does not have a trade agreement with the European Union? No. And in the pocket of, I suspect, just about every person in this hall today is proof of that, are mobile phones. Trade negotiations are complex for a reason. And that reason is they involve negotiation between two countries that are each trying to protect their vital interests while seeking to gain advantages in the country with which they are negotiating. And if you want to know how complex trade negotiations are, remember what Peter Sutherland, who sadly died recently, said when he arrived at GATT to try and rescue the Uruguay round, which he did, and was greeted by a mountain of documents and advice. He said, after a couple of hours of it, if you're not confused, you haven't been listening. Now, the idea that somehow the United Kingdom has been prevented from trading with the rest of the world by our membership of the European Union is a nonsense. What makes sense is for the UK to continue to be part of that customs union, which has given us and the other 27 member states, including the Republic of Ireland, so much. Secondly, the single market. Now, it is true that we will start from a position of alignment with the EU, but I suspect that the word we will all hear a lot more of in the months ahead is divergence. To what extent does the UK wish to diverge from these common rules now and in the years ahead? Michel Barnier, President Macron and others have made it very clear if the UK wishes to remain in the customs union and the single market, then the EU will facilitate this. But if the Prime Minister continues to insist on her red lines, then this will inevitably narrow the range of options open to British negotiators when it comes to our future partnership. The UK worries about free movement, and that's an issue that needs to be discussed and addressed. And the EU worries about two things, it seems to me. First, maintaining the unity of the 27 and not offering Britain such a good deal that it might appear attractive to other member states. And secondly, the worry that the UK will use its freedom to gain a competitive advantage, which will enable us to sell more goods and more services into the European market through the door that we will be asking the EU to leave open for us. And so we find ourselves in this position. It is now 19 months since the referendum. There are only 9 months to go to the end of the negotiations. We are 2/3 of the way through the process, and yet we haven't even yet started negotiating our future relationship with the European Union. It is frankly astonishing. And why are we in this position? Because of the Cabinet's inability, and it's an open secret, to reach agreement even amongst its own members about what it is they want, never mind starting to try to negotiate it. Because the government appears to be contemplating with equanimity going into a negotiation in which, because of those red lines, it is facing the almost certain prospect of coming away with a less good deal for trade and services than the one we currently enjoy, an outcome that will make the UK poorer than it would otherwise have been. Because it has consistently refused to face up to the consequences of those red lines for the border. However skillful the drafting on full alignment as a fallback, no matter how insistent ministers are that come what may, there will be no hard border, no checks and no infrastructure, they currently have absolutely no answer as to how this will be achieved, given that every other trade agreement in the world involves border checks. And because ministers continue to insist that it will be possible to negotiate all of these things, goods, services, security, foreign policy cooperation, policing, information sharing to fight terrorism, the regulation of medicines, aircraft and food safety, the transfer of data, mutual recognition of qualifications, our future role in the 30 or so trade deals which the EU has negotiated, and everything else, and believe you me, it's a very, very, very long list, and complete the process with a full final agreement by the end of this October. And yet they probably won't even start talking about the new partnership until March. Now, no one else thinks that this is remotely likely. I doubt that ministers actually believe it, but the fact that they still maintain that position, I think, weakens their credibility, and it undermines confidence at a time when uncertainty is undermining decisions on the part of companies about their future investment in the United Kingdom. Now, the first thing the negotiators will have to agree now is a transitional period. I think that is a more accurate description than an implementation period, and I don't mean to be picky, because you can only have an implementation period if you've got something to implement, and it's precisely because we don't have anything to implement yet that we require a transitional period. Anyway, whatever you call it, it is essential. Without it, the UK would in all likelihood fall out of the EU without a partnership agreement, and it is because of uncertainty that companies are continuing to make contingency plans to safeguard themselves against that possibility. It's why the Chancellor of the Exchequer correctly described the transition period as a wasting asset. It is very valuable now, but it will be less valuable in the summer. The UK government has had to accept, as the Prime Minister set out in her Florence speech, that during this transitional period, everything will stay the same, apart from the fact we will no longer have a voice in the Council of Ministers or in the European Parliament. What we do know is for that period, we will remain in the customs union and the single market, we'll continue to accept free movement, and we'll have to go on abiding by judgments of the European Court of Justice. What we don't know is what will happen once the transition period is over. And we may still not know at the end of the Article 50 process if much of the negotiation remains to be completed during the transition. And what do we do if the negotiations on a new partnership have not been completed by the time the transition period expires? Well, my answer to that is very simple: extend the transition. But in order to do that, the transition agreement itself must include a clause within it enabling it to be extended by agreement between the parties. So I say this: the UK Parliament will have the final say. It will vote on the draft agreement. But before doing so, I think it will expect to know what our future relationship on trade and services will be, and therefore how that open border will be maintained. The vague offer of a possible post-dated check for an unspecified agreement simply will not do. I want now to turn to some of the wider lessons of what has been happening around us as we seek to build a better world. Having to deal with change has been part of the human condition since the dawn of time, but there is something about the last decade which has been unsettling. I am at heart an optimist about the future, not least because we, all of us, can see with our own eyes the progress we have made as humankind, including the advance of democracy and the extraordinary achievements we have made in reducing absolute poverty around the world, although we have some way further to travel. But the watchwords of this, our age, in truth, are turmoil and uncertainty. Look around us. The continuing and bloody echoes of the Arab Spring, nowhere more tragically heard and witnessed than in Syria. The struggle in places between the secular and the religious. A resurgent Russia, it is said, seeking the velvet glove of respect, uvagenia, while wielding an iron fist. The inexorable dawning of a changing climate and the onward march of technology and innovation. A rising global population that by the time my 2 grandchildren reach my age will be more than 3 times greater than when I was born. And the relentless movement, the point you made, Mr. President, of people across the globe, whether they are fleeing conflict, escaping the consequences of that change in climate, or simply seeking a better life that they see others living, a story that is so much a part of Irish history. And when the story of this century comes to be written, I think it will be defined in many ways by this movement and the way in which we together sought to deal with it. It's not hard to see why there is so much uncertainty. The global financial crash not only shook our economies, it shook people's confidence in our system and in our belief that our children will, of course, enjoy a better life than the one that we have had. And it was in these circumstances that concerns about immigration and change, the loss of what had been familiar, a wish not to be told by others what to do, stagnant wages, economic inequality, austerity, globalization, a sense of powerlessness, a loss of identity, a belief that somehow our country had given up that which had made it great, that led 52% of the British people who voted in the referendum to make that decision and to send us a message that they were not happy about the way things were. It wasn't so much about facts or even about the European Union. It was about the state of their lives and our politics. And if all of my constituents who resisted my arguments as to why they should vote Remain were here today, they would probably look us in the eye and say, you weren't listening to us, but you're listening now, aren't you? More than anything else, I think it was a cry for control. In a world in which change is now happening faster than at any other point in human history, but in which it sometimes seems, particularly to the older generation, that they have barely any control at all over what is happening. And for those who voted Remain, they too experienced on that Friday morning a feeling of loss, of insecurity, of uncertainty, and worry about a future that they think will be worse because the progress and freedoms that the EU has brought will now be taken from them. And that was, I suspect, the feeling here. And the echoes of that campaign, in which our nation was shown to be divided almost exactly down the middle, continue to be felt within our politics. I was, and I still am, a passionate Remainer, but I also respect the result of the referendum, and as Democrats, I think we have a duty to give effect to it, although the only thing it decided was that we are leaving the institutions of the European Union next March. It did not decide the future of our relationship. And I say that because if you think we have a crisis of confidence in British politics already, just imagine what a crisis of confidence we would have had if Parliament had turned around and said to the 52% who voted to leave, "We know better than you." All of these are reasons why we must reach a deal on a new relationship with the European Union. But as nations and as a world, it seems to me that we must also find an answer to the central political question that was posed by the referendum result. How do we hold in a new balance the two great forces of our age, reflected in the principles set out side by side by Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt in what came to be known as the Atlantic Charter of 1941? The first, the self-evident truth that nations must work together to secure better economic and social conditions for all, as we deal with the great challenges we face as a world that increasingly pay no heed to national borders. And the second, the innate thirst for self-determination so that people can shape their own future, the search for control. Now, understanding and then responding to these forces is, I would argue, urgent and important work if we are to see off the populists around us who seek to exploit the frustration, the fear, and the anger that many people feel. What do? They promise a return to a fictitious golden age, when in fact their inward-looking nationalism is a road to nowhere. And the way in which some of them have sought to fan the flames of prejudice towards our fellow citizens, attack the independence of the judiciary, and undermine a free media represents a threat to our way of life. If the last century has taught us anything, it is that international cooperation is at the heart of economic and political security for us all. In Britain's case, it was in the second half of that century that we came to realize that it was far better and more effective to seek to be a global power that achieved its goals through the influence that comes from working with others, rather than holding on to the empire through which we had become a dominant world power, aided, of course, by the Industrial Revolution. And our future relationship with the EU, an increasingly important pole of influence in the world, will therefore be critically important in these uncertain times, with unpredictability to the east in the Kremlin and to the west in the White House. We also need to be forthright in defense of internationalism and the rules-based system that was created out of the ashes and the suffering of the Second World War in the face of the resurgent climate change deniers, the aid cutters, and the isolationists who would have us turn away from our responsibilities one to another. If they ever succeeded, far from taking back control, they would lessen our power and our ability to shape events. This is no time for any of us to be retreating from what helps to give each of us security and influence in the modern world. And what is the one word that sums up the human condition more than any other at the beginning of the 21st century? Well, for me, that word is interdependence. Interdependence, the very definition of what it is to be a human being. While our earliest ancestors first appeared on Earth between 5 and 7 million years ago, it was not until Christmas Eve 50 years ago that we finally understood what that interdependence means. It was the moment when, as the astronauts read from the book of Genesis, William Anders took that immortal photograph from the Apollo space capsule as it came back around the moon. For the very first time, we, humankind, saw our small and fragile planet from a different vantage point, in all its white and green and blue beauty, floating in the blackness of eternity. And what that photograph taught us was that we have to learn to live alongside one another in a way that is peaceful and sustainable, that we have to accept our responsibilities to our neighbours, even if we've never met and they live on the other side of the world, and that the only way to do this is by nation states working together. Cooperation and self-determination do not have to be in tension, and both can be embraced in a way that fosters solidarity and creates a sense of national common purpose. And it is our responsibility to do what needs to be done, because the referendum also sent us in Britain a message about the lives of many people, and that is why we have to commit to change at home. The need to tackle the crisis affecting the way in which we care for our elderly. Getting old is a universal experience. It's our grandparents first, and then it's our mums and dads, and then it will be our turn. This is the greatest social challenge that we face, and it needs money, time, energy, commitment, and reform, because the system is failing and our National Health Service is creaking as a consequence. The need to think about how we will prepare for the future of both of our economies and manage the next wave of automation and innovation and the changing form of employment in a way that doesn't lead to more insecurity, more zero-hours contracts, and more young people completely unable to save for a pension or buy a home. For too long, we have allowed this to happen. The need to build and invest for the long term instead of just thinking about the short term, which we now know to our cost was the cause of the global economic crash that caused so much pain and difficulty. And nowhere is this long-term investment more important than in education and skills and innovation and creativity, the wellsprings of our future development and prosperity, places like Dublin City University. And most important of all, we need to sustain through all of these things a strong economy that will make all of these things possible, which brings me to the task in hand and to why I am an optimist. These are common challenges for both of our countries, but we should not be daunted by them, because we have shown by our own efforts, as you said, Mr. President, how hope can triumph over fear and cynicism. Our islands were the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution and also of the man who created the internet. With less than 1% of the population, we together generate 4.3% of its GDP. The language that we share is spoken by 1.5 billion people worldwide, more than any other. Our literature, our theatre, our films, our actors are loved the world over. Our universities attract the brightest and the best, and each of us, in our own way, has helped to influence and shape the modern world through the power of ideas and values. Democracy, the rule of national and international law, a free media, free trade, and the belief that every single human being has rights that are inalienable, so powerfully and movingly expressed when Ireland became the first country in the world to legalize same-sex marriage by means of a referendum. A reminder of the power of referendums sometimes to be a force for good. All of these ideas shaped our lives, not because we turned our backs on working with others. They came to pass because we embraced others, traveled, traded, built alliances, were open to new ideas, welcomed new people, and turned our minds and our politics to how we could make them happen. We all want the EU to continue to prosper, above all, because its crowning achievement was to bring an end to centuries of conflict on the continent of Europe. And in the words of the Schuman Declaration, its purpose, its political purpose, was to make a return to war not merely unthinkable, but materially impossible. And if you want to understand what that meant, any of us who have visited the graveyards of the First and the Second World War and seen how the flower of 2 generations of young Europeans laid down their lives in those immaculately cared for cemeteries, their names, their ages, for me the most poignant gravestones of all, they simply say, a soldier of the Great War, known unto God, because no one knew then or knows to this day whose son, father, brother, uncle lies beneath those beautifully cared for flower beds. But the EU faces a choice now about its future. Will those who call for an ever faster, closer, deeper union prevail over those who argue for a multi-speed, multi-layer EU as the best way to maintain the unity of its member states? I think it's not our job to participate anymore, but I think the second is the path to take. But it will be for Europe's citizens, the European street, to decide. And I just hope that in making that choice, the EU will at some point pause and quietly ask itself, how did we come to lose one of our most important member states? Now, I want us to find a way of continuing to cooperate on the challenges we together face, not just trade and economics, but foreign policy, defense, security, and the fight against global poverty. And I also want to see our relationship, the relationship between our 2 countries, prosper as we do all in our power to maintain these close bonds, that thread, despite the referendum result. You are our closest friend and neighbour, and you will remain our closest friend and neighbour. As Yeats, it is said, put it, there are no strangers here, only friends you haven't yet met. And whatever happens, we must strive to ensure that nothing gets in the way of our shared economic interests, the free movement of our peoples between our 2 countries, and the bond that has been forged in a shared history, which despite the pain of the past, has brought us closer together now, and I'm sure will continue to do so in the many years that lie ahead. Gurumila moi hogid. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Benn, for that beautifully reflective and profound reflection on our relationship and on Europe and on the power of referenda. We have a few minutes for questions. If people would like to ask questions from the floor, if you kind of raise your hand, some of our students will identify you. Maybe if you identify yourselves before you ask the questions. So we just have a few moments. Have we anybody?
Cannot be stunned silent, surely.
Gentleman here. Would you identify yourself, please, and ask the question? Thank you.
Ian Cooper, Brexit Institute at DCU. Would you support a second referendum, I should say a third referendum, really, in which the alternative to, which would be a referendum on whatever deal is struck between the UK and the EU, and the alternative, if it's voted down, would be remaining in the EU?
We can take them, the questions as they come.
Thank you
very much for that question, Ian. I don't mind if, I hope you don't mind if I'm familiar. The deal always is you can call me whatever you like in return. The straight answer to your question is this. I don't think that is going to happen for this reason. The first is we have just had a referendum. And I would say, reflecting the views of my constituents, I met many people who knew exactly what they were doing. Secondly, and this is a reflection for Europe, the EU has a bit of a history of saying to countries, and in Ireland you know all about this, we didn't like the result you gave us last time, go and do your homework again. And the third is, even though there's been some change in opinion, I'm not at all certain that if there were another referendum we would get a different result. Now, who knows what the future may hold. But the reason I said what I said about the role of Parliament in agreeing the deal is it's Parliament's job now to speak on behalf of all of the people, to bring the nation back together, the 52 and the 48%. And the reason why, if I may say, I voted for the Article 50 legislation was simply this. You can say, in all honesty, to those who voted leave, we're leaving the institutions, that's what you voted for. And then, if we turn our attention to what choices we're going to make about our future relationship, you have the argument on different ground, because you can say to someone who voted leave, now explain to me why you might want to walk away with no deal when it will make your cars 10% more expensive. Tell me why you want to make it more difficult for our financial services industry to sell into Europe. Tell me why you want us to replicate the whole of the European system for certifying the safety of new aircraft and their engines. We should be a member of EASA. We should stay in EASA. So that is the way that I see that. And I would just point out that the Liberal Democrats who fought the election on a commitment to a second referendum thought that this would bring a lot of Remainers to support them, and the evidence suggests very clearly that that was not a very successful approach to have taken.
Thank you. Have we another question? There's a gentleman here, I think, is next. Is this at the front? Halfway along. Can you stand up, please, so Natalie can see you? Thank you.
Someone up there.
Is there somebody there as well? We'll go this gentleman first, and then we'll come to yourself. Thank you. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, Kevin Vickers, Canadian Ambassador to Ireland. For well over a decade now, we've had a free trade agreement with Canada and the United States. We've implemented the best practices that we can to have a frictionless border. U.S. Customs officers up in Canada pre-clearing goods coming to the States, Canadian Customs officers pre-clearing goods to go to the United States, but still mile-long waits at the border. Like, this is fantasy. Like, how does this word, frictionless border, continue to be accepted in the media by you people?
Well,
That's it. And he's a diplomat, yeah.
You absolutely make a point. Now, as I said, David Davis yesterday was talking about the border between Canada and America and gave the impression it was all very quick and easy. But I did afterwards type into Google Canada-America border customs posts, and up came photographs of what you've just described. There is infrastructure. There are queues. People have to show things. And that is why, so far, all of the things that the government has said, we can use electronics. Somebody once suggested you could use tethered zeppelins to keep an eye on what was travelling back and forth across the border. In fairness, I think they probably talked about drones or airships, but I call them tethered zeppelins for effect. But none of them have proved to be workable. Nobody has been convinced, and the Select Committee I have the honour to chair, well, we were convinced, which is why we said we don't see how the two things can be reconciled. And I think the moment has come now where the government makes choices and there are consequences. And if you don't want those consequences to come to pass, you have to make a different choice. And that is why I'm doing my best, along with many other people, to push the argument about membership of the Customs Union and how we can stay as close as possible to the single market, if not be part of it. Because it seems to me that that is the only answer to the question. And we, above all, here in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, in the rest of the United Kingdom, understand better than anyone else just how important it is to keep the border as it is now. So, all party elbow and keep making the case.
Thank you. We have time for one last question. The lady on the balcony. Could you introduce yourself, please? Yeah.
Annelieke Mooi, PhD student here at DCU. And my question is, do you think Brexit is permanent, or can you foresee a future whereby the UK rejoins the EU?
Well, now, look, in life, never say never. We're going to end up in a position where, look, I hope very much we get the best possible deal. I mean, that I'm sure you all take as read, because I want to minimise any adverse impact. I want the strongest and the closest relationship we can possibly find. But we will end up being having a relationship with an organisation where we have no say in determining the rules. And as the Norwegians made very clear, indeed the Norwegian Prime Minister pointed out during the course of the referendum, I wouldn't do that if I were you. I think it was referred to as the faxocracy. In the days when people still had faxes, the faxes would come through from the EU and Norway would have to do a whole kind of range of things. And I would just make this other observation. It was really striking to me during the course of the referendum, the contrast between the view of many people who were campaigning to leave, who somehow saw the United Kingdom as this 7-stone weakling having sand kicked in its face. You have to be of a certain age to get that particular cultural reference, and all the time being defeated by the other member states of the European Union. Whereas I know I've seen with my own experience as someone who attended the European Council of Ministers for 7 years, as an International Development Secretary and the Environment Secretary, Britain was very good at getting what it wanted, building alliances. We were very influential and important member state. And yet these two views, that view wasn't being reflected in too much of political debate in the United Kingdom. Now, if we end up in the position with a decent deal but with no voice, then who knows, at some time in the years ahead, people would say, wouldn't it be better if we had a bit of a voice? But for now, we've been given our instructions by the electorate, and we have to get on and deliver that for the reasons that I set out, to do with confidence in the political system. And it's a very, very serious point that I was seeking to make. But that'll probably be for the next generation to decide.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Ben. I'm very conscious of time, that a great tribute to Hilary is the fact that the President of Ireland, His Excellency, has remained with us. I'll ask you please to be upstanding in a moment while the President exits the theatre. But just on your behalf and on behalf of the University and the Brexit Institute, I'd like to thank Hilary immensely for his presence and for his thought-provoking presentation. So, Gurv Míle Magat.